Good morning, everybody. Thank you, David, for gathering us in with your heartfelt music to some context-setting history about Iras, wrestling with aspects of this week's theme, and acknowledging stories of transformation that can emerge for any of us in Iras on Star Island. And second, a shorter closing section, Digging for China, a tool perhaps for wrestling a bit of hope from uncertainty relative to our theme, the tool of vulnerability, of what it means to be running out of time for our sweet planet and for all that finds home here. This awareness is not unrelated to having to face the ideal that this October I will mark the completion of my 80th year. However, I am concerned that I might not have a party. The last real birthday party I had was when I was 40. My husband Frank Topa, who is 10 years younger than I am, and I were engaged at the time, and he threw me a fabulous and totally surprise birthday party. So with saving time in mind, I wondered whether I might draw on some of my previous work as Iras chaplain. I thought of and have those chapel talks I did in earlier years. Every minister who does guest preaching refers to pulling one from the barrel. Frank chides me about making too much work for myself by creating a new sermon or series for each new location and time, and so I thought I'll show him. I pulled those babies from 1993 out of the file cabinet, and given the theme that year, found some things I might use. 30 years ago, that was. Even folks who go back that far won't remember a thing, I thought. Much less that I was even the chaplain. But then, when I was preparing my stuff for the Orange Book for Dave Klotz, its editor, he wrote me something back like, "Oh yeah, I remember, that was the first year I came." Blah, blah, blah. That was the first year I came to Iras and you were the chaplain and you did a talk on the Harley in the living room. Well, those talks were handwritten. I did own my first computer given to me by my Arlington UU church, but it was a desktop, a little too big to bring to the island, even though there were no real weight limits at that time. I had yet to find that writing sermons on a keyboard came as naturally as with a pen on a piece of lined paper, so typing them was something done after the fact, if my procrastination left enough time, which it almost never did. So why when I pulled those 30-year-old talks from my file cabinet did I find, alongside the handwritten copies, perfectly typed copies and on yellow paper? I never owned yellow paper, much less typed on it. Here I am welcoming you to meet, if you haven't already, another of the unseen guests at every Iras conference, named in our opening reading, that of love. There are all kinds of love here. But it was a certain kind of love that left me with those typed copies on yellow paper that I could actually read. During that week, Jane Bankston typed up my handwritten copies. She is a beloved, longtime Iras leader and a marvel of a friend. And the word friend, in some of its roots, is related to free. Doesn't a true friend free you to find some of the best parts of yourself? Without Jane, in spite of my best efforts, ever since second grade to master penmanship, I've failed. 30 years later, those handwritten copies are hard to read. So yeah, I'm going to use some of it, Jane. Thank you. The other unseen guest during our week, the one I haven't mentioned yet, Faith, we will welcome in today's next and sort of closing reflection. It seems to me that woven throughout the theme of this week's conference is an insistent calling to us to wrestle with uncertainty, in addition to the day that will focus on that. We will be challenged to do that in various contexts and ways relative to our fear of catastrophic climate change and our love of this earth, which gives us life. If we can name some of the tools with which we might befriend and practice facing uncertainty in our daily personal and communal lives, perhaps we'd be better to be enlightened and strengthened, to befriend uncertainty as we explore technology in a way that serves justice for all and hope for our sweet earth. Our opening reading named the three unseen guests that accompany us in our seeking such tools, two of which I've named, hope and love. But faith, or what I call the activity of faithing, is present, I believe, the moment we engage with uncertainty in any domain. My experience is that of the theologian Paul Tillich, who wrote a lot about the opposite of faith not being doubt, but certainty. The opposite of faith is certainty. In his little book, The Dynamics of Faith, he acknowledges that doubt is, of course, at times essential, as in its being an essential tool of doing much reliable science. But often, doubt is just a stubborn, hard-nosed defense against the activity of faithing, of risking the unbridled pursuit, though not the careless one, of that which you take to be your ultimate concern. Risking, faithing, even though you might encounter your own vulnerability, fall flat on your face, or make a complete idiot of yourself. And so today I want to name only the first tool upon which we might draw, naming your vulnerability. Vulnerability in its roots means wounded. Going back to the 1993 chapel talks and my paraphrasing of Carol Albright, you can hear her affirm the transforming power of this tool. She asked, "Can we reach for a global ethic? We're hindered in this reaching by our religious disparity, and we are hindered because we can't keep up with the deluge of new information surrounding rapid scientific and social change." She said, you know this is 30 years ago, "We can't keep up with programming our VCRs." Figuring out the extent to which we want to engineer away our human frailties and make technological process into our religion. Most of us can't make totally informed ethical choices, let alone find a global religious ethic to guide us. Carol suggested that in the face of these uncertainties and vulnerabilities, she says, we must proceed with our efforts to make ethical decisions anyway. We have to accept the limitations of our knowledge and of our cognitive abilities and of our moral sensitivity and act anyway. We can't let seeking keep us from following our own unique calling and inclinations. And she asked, what is it that sustains us as we risk unwise decisions? Grace, she answered. Sin boldly, and grace will hold you and teach you, and perhaps eventually bring your sincere efforts into creative exchange with others. Might we recognize, name, and share personal stories of our own vulnerability, our pursuing things that matter, no matter the risk of failure, in order that we might, sooner or later, strengthen ourselves and make a difference for good in the world. Well, Digging for China is a tiny closing story from my life as a vulnerable 7-year-old struggling to be older in 3rd grade. My father was a newly appointed professor at Bangor Theological Seminary in Maine, later president. We lived in an old house on seminary property, a house with a big backyard. In that yard was a goldfish pond. that my parents filled in with sand. It wasn't great sand. Actually, it was just dirt, and mostly I avoided it. But one day, my mother, who loved being a high school science teacher until she quit when she got married, must have been tired of her routine as a wife and mother and sent me way out back into that pit of dirt with clear instructions. Drawing on her expert descriptions of the layers of Earth's core, she awed me into believing that if I sat in that pile of dirt and worked at it long enough, I would come to China. She was so specific about the layers I might encounter. The surface water and dirt, then rock, then magma, I think. I remember hearing about magma. I don't remembering her saying anything about how hot this journey was. All I knew was that in my world, in Bangor, Maine, in 1950, my world was somewhat small and controlled and not always friendly, even at home. In some ways, I needed to get out of there, and China sounded to me like as good a choice as any. I remember the specific images that danced in my head, although by today's more enlightened view, those images probably were created from some stereotypes at the time. But they were exciting to me, especially the idea of catching a ride in a cycle rickshaw. I could see it. I must have seen pictures somewhere. I had one rusty, pitted trowel for this journey to my imagined independence. I can still see it with a grubby wooden handle. I don't know how long I dug, and I'm sure I never confronted my mother about her science. I grew gradually into realizing I'd been an idiot, but also into compassion for her needing time alone. I remembered that story this past May when I was trying to set up a planter of herbs on the deck. I had the plants and a big bag of soil enriched with manure, but no tool. My 3 carefully stored trowels, hanging on nails in the shed, had disappeared. A few of you who know Frank, might guess that he had borrowed them for good reason, but then figured if I needed them back, I just could ask him where they were. You might see where this is going. Right back to my vulnerability of losing control and independence. I'd have to ask him for the trowels and then explain why I needed them. It might seem a stretch, but I know that I'm of a whole lot more use in the world when I have a strong sense of my own freedom to act independently if I so choose. I almost feel I've been digging for that most of my life. So there I was, 72 years later, and no adequate tool for the task of digging, using my hands to scoop the mushy manure dirt from the bag into the planter for the kitchen herbs. I inquired about the lost trowel, but got sort of a blank stare. I washed up, cleaned my fingernails, and the next time my son, Isaac, who's arriving here Wednesday, so I can talk about him today, the next time he was around, I fairly shouted, "I know what I want for Mother's Day." It can be risky to practice asking, trying for what you need in any domain in order to flourish personally and perhaps as a result to be strengthened for making a difference with the things that really matter. As the grace of surprise might have it, my creative interchange, as Carol put it, with him did indeed bear fruit, or trowels in this case. 3 of them. I just had to do that show and tell. These are now secured, when they're not here, in my personal lockbox when not being used to plant new life or dig deeper into things that matter. Follow your own unique calling, inclinations, loves, in spite of any risk or vulnerability. What is yet to be that might even serve hope and justice for us all. A story